In a recent op-ed in the New York Times, one journalist of color reveals her own experience with dealing with the lack of diversity in various newsrooms. And she says journalists of color are having their own Me Too moment and speaking openly about racism in their newsrooms. So joining us right now is award-winning journalist and CEO of Soledad O'Brien Productions, as well as host of Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien. Good morning, Soledad. So great to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
Okay, so you really tackle a deep-seated problem in newsrooms across the country in this op-ed, and you know it firsthand because when you learned that at your first on-air job in San Francisco that you were an affirmative action hire despite being a Harvard grad, so how big of a wake-up call was that for you?
You know, I think the point of my op-ed was, I think for every journalist of color, that's not a particularly unusual situation. I was walking down the hall and I came across a bunch of people talking, new job for me. So I kind of did one of those awkward slide into the conversations. And the conversation was about the new affirmative action hire. And about 3 seconds in, because everybody was suddenly very awkward, I realized like, oh, that's me. I'm the affirmative action hire in this new gig in my job in San Francisco. And I don't think it's an unusual story. I mean, it certainly wasn't like life-altering and devastating, but it was, oh, this is how it is. And actually, having been in the business for 31 years, it's kind of how it consistently is. So when I called it a Me Too moment for journalists, I just think journalists are more comfortable, part of that is because of social media, calling out the things that we see in our own industry: bias, unfairness, lack of opportunity, and also sometimes just point of view and framing of stories. Often, I think newsrooms like to think they're serving an audience that's 100% white. And we know that a number of cities are majority minority. So you have to think about serving your entire audience and speaking to an entire audience.
And you tackle this a lot on social media. You call out all kinds of different journalists, the organizations, the networks. You're trying to take them to task on that. And full transparency here, actually, Soledad and I used to work together at CNN at the same time. And while there, Soledad, I don't know if you felt it, but I did. There was a camaraderie among colleagues of color. We had a support system, right? I know you reached out to me, I reached out to you, and it was so nice to feel that. But most networks are underrepresented when it comes to journalists of color, right? So explain to us how that really warps news coverage.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, right? Which is, to some degree, there's not a critical mass of journalists of color. So, for example, we know that in a very large percentage of newsrooms, diversity has actually gone down at a time when the diversity of the country has actually increased. I think that's problematic. And of course, depending on kind of your own experiences and your lived experiences, who you think about deserves a voice, it's going to frame who you put on television. The show we do, Matter of Fact, we actually have a spreadsheet of who we put on TV because we want to make sure that we actually have like gender parity, racial parity. If we're talking about Native Americans, we want to talk to Native Americans. If we're talking about women business owners, we want to make sure it's women who are talking about business. We just want to make sure we're elevating all voices. But I think you have to do it with a lot of intention. You can't just say, well, I'm hoping for the best and I don't think I'm biased. You actually have to track it. And journalism itself has to track it as well, as we call it out in other industries too.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up a very good point that I want to ask you about because you tackle this as well in that op-ed. And when it comes to news coverage and using these panels to discuss social injustice, you say some of these panels really get guests that are liars and they are promoting bigotry and that kind of thinking under the veil of this is an expert. So how is that happening in this age when these guests are supposed to be vetted?
Yeah, you know, I think it's about kind of both sides journalism. Well, we hear these people say this, but these people say this, and what we're going to do is just let them talk, and you guys can decide who you want to hear from. One, I try to not put people who are not experts on television. They just don't deserve to be on. And number two, I think if someone is a verified liar, you have to frame their conversation as lying, or you have to say, we're not going to give you the mic, we can interview you, or we can frame the chunk of what you're saying that we think is important. But when you hand someone your platform, you give them a lot of credibility. You give them, in some ways, your stamp of approval. So I think there's a lot of things that journalism could be doing to do a better job in how we reflect our viewers. I think that's our job, is to make sure we're serving our audience. I don't think it's brain surgery.
Yeah.
But if you, for example, I'll give you a 2-second example. Actually, this is from CNN. A producer called me once and said, you know, who's Steve Harvey? he had just written a book, Think Like a Man, and 12 million radio listeners. And she's like, well, I just never heard of him. I guess I don't think I'm going to book him because I just don't know who it is.
What?
You know, it's so right, I know. And by the way, I'm sure you do too, 12, 20, 50 stories like this, right? This idea that this person's point of view is
Right.
going to dictate what her audience will get to see, even if the audience itself actually should be exposed or probably knows who someone
And that's
like
why those
Steve Harvey.
diverse voices, I should say, need to be represented there. Soledad, thank you so much for speaking out and speaking up. We appreciate your time as always.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
Good to see you as well.